As a follow-up to our recent podcast regarding the life and times of Anne Frank, we asked author Alexandra Ritchie to tell us more about the horrors of World War II and Poland. Richie, a citizen of Canada, now lives in the city which is the title of her book, Warsaw. Her focus is on 1944 and what was called the Warsaw Uprising. In her introduction, she writes, Himmler and Hitler had decided that the entire population remaining in one of Europe's great capital cities was to be murdered in cold blood. Himmler referred to Warsaw as the Great Abscess, which was to be completely destroyed. Alexandra Ritchie, what was the Warsaw Uprising?
The Warsaw Uprising was an attempt by the Poles, the Polish Home Army, to, in a way, prove to the rest of the world that Poland had been fighting since September 1939 on every front in Europe, and they did not want to be taken over by one dictatorship, then taken over by another. In other words, they wanted to fight against the Nazis, but they wanted to also prove to the world that they didn't want to simply be taken over by the Soviets. We're talking about the 1st of August, 1944. So the Red Army has just had its huge success in Bagration, the great summer offensive of 1944. And whereas earlier in the war, the Poles had sort of hoped that maybe the Americans and the Brits would liberate them, by 1944 summer, it's obvious that it's going to be the Soviets. And they're very, very well aware of what being occupied by Stalin looks like. And so they were determined to make a stance to show the Soviets that they weren't just going to be taken over, that they'd also made a show of their strength and that they'd shown the world that they deserved to be treated as equal partners, effectively.
How did you get involved in this particular book?
Well, I had been coming to Central Eastern Europe since the mid-1980s. And when I first came to Warsaw, I mean, back then, especially when it was still under communism, it was a shattered city still. I mean, there had been attempts to rebuild it under the communists, the Soviet Stalin era blocs and so on. But I was just amazed by the destruction. And of course, I started to talk to people and realized that this was one of these horrific stories of World War II, which, like so many things that happened behind the Iron Curtain, was just not known about. And so I started talking to people. I later met my husband. His father had been in the Warsaw Uprising. So had his mother, actually one of the very famous women's sapper units in this unit called Kedif, and she was extraordinary. And so I started to meet the people who'd been in the uprising. And I thought, it's a story that so few people in the West know about. It really deserves a book or some sort of treatment. Now, there were other scholars who'd worked on it before, people like Norman Davies and others. But I tried to take a slightly different perspective. In other words, rather than I would say the kind of traditional Polish perspective, which was, the Germans were nasty, but then the Soviets just sat on the other side of the river and didn't do anything to help us. And it was more a sort of resentment against the Soviets. The fundamental question I wanted to ask was why, when the war was almost over, really, I mean, in real terms, Hitler had such a vindictive reaction to Warsaw and to the Poles, that even though men and material were so drastically needed on the front, he took his resources and fought in and then crushed the city of Warsaw. And so that was really the fundamental question that I was trying to get to, rather than the sort of Cold War treatment, which was always about how awful the Soviets had been.
Tell me if this statistic is correct. I looked it up on my own, that in 1939, when the war started, there were some 3 million Jews in Poland, and
Yes.
Today there are 10,000.
Yeah, the Jewish community is growing, but yes, that's more or less the figure. Quite a few hundreds of thousands of Jews actually survived, many of them in the Soviet Union, and then came back to Poland immediately after the war. But the conditions were terrible. Many of them came back to find out that they were the only member of their family that was left. Then there was anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic pogroms. There was an incorrect association between the Jews, particularly those coming back from the Soviet Union, and communism. There were Jewish communists, but not all Jews were communists by any stretch of the imagination. And then, of course, the politics took its own turn because Stalin and the Soviets then he became much more anti-Semitic, but then the Soviets, therefore the Eastern Bloc countries, fought against or turned against Israel, for example, in 1968. And there were official shows of anti-Semitism by the Polish and other communist governments in the Eastern Bloc. So many Jews just felt unwelcome, and many left. But I must say that particularly since the collapse of communism, that Poland has done a great deal. There have been hiccups along the way with various governments behaving in an inept manner. But generally speaking, I'd say that the number of young Polish scholars, Polish Jewish scholars, and others who are very interested in this history. There's this great museum, Polin Museum, in the center of Warsaw, and what used to be the Warsaw Ghetto, which was named, I think, Museum of the Year in Europe in 2016 or something. There's a wonderful attempt to look at the history of 1,000 years of Jews living on these territories. So it's a very complicated story. But the mass murder by the Nazis was horrific. And the thing that I constantly feel when you're in particularly Warsaw is that Warsaw was the second largest after New York Jewish city in the world. And layers upon layers of culture, languages, politics, newspapers, theaters, scholars, just unbelievable. And this was what was just ripped out of Europe. And this incredible culture and its entire legacy was ended, in the case of Warsaw, largely in the gas chambers at Treblinka.
Do you see any comparison from back then with all the countries involved, whether it's the Soviet Union, Germany, Poland, or whatever, and today with the Soviet Union, Ukraine, United States, and European countries? Is there anything that we can learn from that time that applies to this time?
Well, many things. I mean, I'm very much against sort of easy, this happened and this is 1933 again, or this is 1936 again. I mean, the conditions were very different. There's absolutely no way that you can compare what Hitler did and his whole project, the mass extermination of an entire race of people, not to mention Slavs and Roma and Sinti and homosexuals and many other people that fell under his control. Stalin too, a brutal dictator who was perfectly happy to murder millions of his own citizens, and the Great Terror and the famine in Ukraine, a Holodomor, and all these other things were on a scale that's actually, I find, even though I spent my whole life working on this, I still find it almost impossible to understand the scale of the violence, of the horror that was meted out, when Europe effectively committed suicide for the second time on the continent in the 20th century. I think that the warnings are looking for those signs of the beginnings of these sorts of things. I mean, look at we always say never again, and there's a warning from history and so on. I think some of the constellations, some of the things that happened, some of the hate speech, some of the violence against minorities, this sort of thing, it's a warning sign that the rise of the far right wing parties in Europe, these are things that really we have to watch and fight against and write against and demonstrate against, and try and also listen to the reasons why people are going in this direction, and what is it that they feel is failing in their lives that let's say in Germany today, what is it that's attracting Germans to the AfD, for example. In other words, look at these things squarely in the eye and try and see how one deals with them, rather than just pretending that they're not happening. But not easy parallels between World War II and the present day.
If you read your book, it's brutal when you talk about what happened to Poles, especially the Jews. Tell us about somebody that you discovered who was, it sounds like a crazy way to go with questions, but who was the most brutal of the Germans that showed up in that country back in 1944.
Well, the most horrific character who was in the SS was known as Oskar Dirlewanger. And he was a psychopath. He was a child molester, a rapist. I mean, he was just a horrific human being. And because he was in the SS, he was actually sanctioned even by the SS through his career. But he ended up in Belarusia, working under the auspices of Erich von den Bach-Zaleski, who was also a brutal killer, murderer, and criminal. And their task in Belarusia was to basically murder civilians, mostly Jews, but also anybody else that they labeled as quote unquote partisans. If you were a quote unquote partisan, you were simply going to be murdered. So they went after, village after village, just rounding people up, murdering them, pushing them into lakes, the Missourian lakes or whatever else area, mass murdering tens and tens of thousands of human beings. So, of course, I mentioned a great Soviet summer offensive in the summer of 1944 that pushed the Germans back. And therefore, these guys were kind of out of a job because the territory that they'd been controlling in the anti-partisan war was now taken over by the Soviets. And Erich von den Bach-Zaleski goes up to the resort at Sopot and complains to his wife, "I have nothing to do, what's going on?" And then the Warsaw Uprising begins, and Himmler calls von den Bach-Zaleski to control the uprising. And von den Bach goes, "Well, I know exactly the guy that I can get to do this because he's really good at killing civilians, mass murdering civilians, and he'd be perfect for this job." So he calls on Oskar Dirlewanger, and Oskar Dirlewanger takes his SS units into the beginning in the western unit area of Wola, the Wola district in Warsaw, and they simply start mass murdering civilians. It doesn't matter, men, women, children, they're all fair game as far as they're concerned. This is the so-called Wola massacre, where around about 30,000 people are killed in a day and a half.
This is out of context, and it's just a footnote. I mean, you can get this all through your book, and I'll read it, and you can help me with the names. During the trial, Han's secretary, named Irene, is it Shimolevitz, excuse me, I don't even know why I tried it, testified that during the uprising, around 1,000 Polish citizens had been herded into the cadet school in Lazienka Park. 3 young girls were chosen by members of the SIPO. What is SIPO? SIPO.
Yes, it's the Sicherheitspolizei. It's a German kind of. It wasn't the SS. It was part of the kind of Gestapo police units that were used to round people up, to control crowds, and so on.
They were forced to drink alcohol until they were completely inebriated, then raped. One was raped by Hahn. Another witness, SS Obersturmführer Stern, ordered her immediate execution. When nobody volunteered, Hahn shot her himself. I mean, you get this throughout this whole book, and I just, how was it to write it and to research it?
It was horrific, absolutely horrific. Very often had to just leave it and go and do something else completely. But the thing is that, of course, the Warsaw Uprising was a very concentrated, horrific moment in the war. But this is just at the tip of the iceberg as to how the level of violence that was meted out, as I said, Ukraine, Belarusia. And once you got east of the Elbe River, basically, once you start going into the east, the level of crime and violence was horrific. And so if you look at, as I said, what Dirlewanger was doing in Belarusia, it's only now being written about. There's much more interest in these crimes, particularly the so-called Holocaust by bullets, which was the first real mass murder of over 1 million Jews into pits by bullet during the Operation Barbarossa. So that was the first sort of phase, really, of the mass murder in the Holocaust. And then comes the liquidation of the camps using camps like Helmno, Treblinka, then Auschwitz-Birkenau, and so on. So that was the level of violence in the Holocaust against the Jews, but this was also meted out in a different way, of course, but because the violence against the Jews was all-encompassing. But the level of violence in the Eastern Front, also between soldiers, what the SS was up to and so on, was just on a scale that's very, very difficult for us to even comprehend. And that's why, of course, writing about the Warsaw Uprising is terrible. And it was also just so pointless. It was just such a ridiculous, stupid, vindictive, callous act against a city and its civilians. But the point I'm trying to make is that this was nothing particularly unusual if you lived in a Belarusian city or a Ukrainian town.
Bielorussia is now Belarus.
Yes. Yeah.
The other point in the book that caught my attention, it's unbelievable, is that if you were Jewish and they put you in one of those railroad cars and headed toward Treblinka, nobody got out alive.
Very few. There were one or two stories of people who managed to get, crawl out of windows or, managed to get off the trains. And then there were one or two people who managed to survive. There was a very famous example of a carpenter who the Germans just picked him off the train when they were sorting people through and said, "Is there somebody who can do carpentry?" And he was able to go to all different parts of the camp and then get back to Warsaw illegally and tell the Home Army what was going on in Treblinka. And there were other members of the Jewish underground, for example, who were also sent out to Treblinka, but the numbers were very small. Treblinka, in my view, was you can't make a measure on this sort of violence or horror. But it was one of the most horrific camps because it functioned for just over a year, and over 850,000 people were murdered there. So it wasn't that much less than Auschwitz-Birkenau. But Auschwitz is so much better known because it was a camp as well. There were 40 subcamps. People were slave laborers as well. Many people survived. At Treblinka, the estimate is about 75 people survived out of over 850,000 people. If you were, as you said, if you were put on that train, your chances of survival were almost nil, and people were murdered within a couple of hours. It was again a true factory of mass murder, of death.
So if I were Jewish in Poland, what would my life have been like starting in 1939? What would a day-to-day life be like?
Well, it's interesting because it sort of leapfrogs, right? The initial really ferocious attacks when the Germans first come into Poland are to unleash the so-called Einsatzgruppen. These are special killing squads against the Polish intelligentsia, because their first aim was to crush all possible resistance. So at the beginning, the Jews thought, well, we're going to get through this. You can see it if you've seen the film The Pianist. They're sitting around saying, "Oh yes, okay, the British and the French have declared war. Now we're going to be fine. It'll all be fine." And the people who are being targeted are, Polish professors and so on. Now, if you were a Polish Jewish professor, you were also targeted. Or if you were a landowner, if you were a banker, if you were an important figure, and you were a Jewish professional, whatever, you'd also be included. But then the Germans, and they did this divide and conquer technique all the way through the East when they were taking over, to turn groups of people against one another. So the next target was the Jews, the Jewish populations. They used the Judenrat, this sort of councils of Jews in cities like Warsaw or Łódź or Krakow, to draw up lists of all the Jewish citizens living in the area. The Judenrat thought they were being helpful. You cooperate with the Germans, everything's going to be fine. And the Germans then used this information to create the ghettos. In Warsaw, for example, wall in the Jews. So by 1941, the Jews are walled into effectively what's a huge prison in the center of the city of Warsaw. And then it becomes almost impossible to get out. And people do, they try and sort of get out to what's called the Aryan side. But then the problem was, how do you survive on the so-called Aryan side? Because there was a lot of anti-Semitism. People were frightened to help, or they were bystanders, did nothing, or they were actually so-called schmalzowniks. They were blackmailers who targeted the Jews, trying to squeeze money or possessions out of them. So it was a very mixed bag on the other side of the wall. And so Jews couldn't be certain that they would find a place to hide or safety, or they thought they'd find safety, and then the people who were hiding them turned against them. And then, of course, the Germans declared that anybody who was caught aiding Jews would be killed along with their family. So that was another deterrent. So the situation was dire. And then, of course, the Wannsee conference happens, and the Germans decide that it's now time for the mass murder of the Jews who are now being held in the ghettos all over Poland. So that's sort of, as I said, I mentioned the Holocaust by bullets first, and then the next phase is the basically liquidation of these huge, giant, basically prisons all over Poland. And the camp that was used for Warsaw was Treblinka. Now, as Treblinka, the Jews begin to realize, pretty quickly what's going on. As I said, they had their own underground organizations. They cooperated with the Polish Home Army. They knew that people were being mass murdered in Treblinka, and so they decided to stage this tremendously heroic uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. Of course, they knew that they would all be killed, but the decision was made because they decided that they would rather go to their deaths, fighting with a gun in their hand than just be led off to be slaughtered on the trains of and end up in Treblinka. I had the great privilege of knowing one of the only survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the last commander who died some years ago, Marek Edelman, who later became a very famous heart surgeon. He stayed in Poland, and he said, we all knew we were going to die. It didn't matter. We wanted to die with dignity, and that's actually also a huge difference between the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, when the Jewish victims, really were slated for utter and complete destruction, compared to the Warsaw Uprising a year and a bit later, 1st of August 1944, which was much more of a political statement. The Polish Catholics or Polish fighters who stood up in August 1st, 1944, were making a decision to try and make a sort of political point about post-war Europe. The Jews had no choice whatsoever. They were being mass murdered all over Europe. And this is something that one has to remember in this part of the world, that especially under the communists, under the Soviet historiography, there was no Holocaust. Everybody was just a victim of fascism. But there was a tremendous difference between, even despite all the violence that was being meted out to the other Poles or other people who lived in this region, but the Jews were singled out for specific, complete and utter annihilation. And there were some other groups, the Roma and Sinti, as well. But really, this mass murder against the Jews was something, and it haunts this part of the world. It just, the total decimation, loss of this culture, plus the way in which it was done, the violence, the cruelty, the inhumanity. And then there are the other sort of little glimmers of I wouldn't even say hope, but people who, like the Ringelblum archives that were saved, this Emanuel Ringelblum and this little group of scholars and friends of his. He was a great intellectual. And in the ghetto, they realized that they were going to be eliminated, exterminated like vermin. And they went and gathered everything, diaries and newspaper clippings, theater bills, everything to show, there was this amazing culture here. And they hid these documents in milk cartons, milk cans, and sort of metal crates, and buried them in the ghetto. And miraculously, most of them were found after war.
We'll pause for a moment and be right back. You say in your acknowledgments that you were introduced to this story by your father-in-law. Explain that.
Well, when I met my husband at Oxford many, many, many years ago, I very, very quickly after that met his dad, who lived in Warsaw, and he'd had an extraordinary history. He was a Polish Catholic, but he was also taken to Auschwitz as an 18-year-old boy. He was arrested by the Germans because he happened to live in the district that I live now in Warsaw, sort of intellectuals and professors and journalists and that kind of thing. And every man between 16 and 60 in that district was taken to Auschwitz. So he was on the second transport from Warsaw to Auschwitz. His number was 4427. And because he'd done work for the Red Cross, he was a stretcher bearer during the quite ferocious attack on Warsaw in 1939 in September. There was the siege of Warsaw then. And because of this link to the Red Cross, his parents were able to get him out. There were about 1,600 people who were gotten out that year from Auschwitz, and he was one of the very lucky ones. And he came back to Warsaw, and he went to see his priest because he was completely shattered by Warsaw. He had sepsis, he had typhus, he was incredibly ill, and he said he sort of, not to say that he felt sorry for himself, but he was lost. And his priest said, help people who are worse off than you are. Just stop complaining. You've been saved for a reason. And he became a co-founder of an organization called Żegota. It's a nonsense name, but it was an organization made up of both Jews and non-Jews, Catholics, to try and help and give aid to the Jews in Warsaw, and in fact, later on all around Poland. So they found secret hiding places, they got food, they got medical care, they got false papers, false identities, and so on. And so he went, did as much as he could to help the Jews, and then he fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and then after the war was promptly put in prison for 7 years by Stalin, because of course Stalin didn't like these sorts of people very much. But he became a honorary citizen of Israel. He has 2 trees at Yad Vashem one for his work in Jagotta and one for his own work saving people. So he was quite an amazing man. He later became foreign minister in Poland after the collapse.
Is your husband in the legislature?
Yeah, he's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs now in Poland. So he's kind of followed on in his father's footsteps, I suppose.
What countries border Poland today?
Well, unfortunately, there's a little bit of it that's Russia, which is the little enclave that used to be Kaliningrad, and Belarus, Ukraine, and then Germany on the western side. So and then goes into Czechoslovakia.
Do you feel any of the fallout, excuse me, from the war going on in Ukraine? If you live where you do?
Huge. It's just, I mean, from the moment it started, first of all, here, I was born in Canada, so I grew up, with very much the sort of North American view of two oceans and aren't we all right, whatever else. When you come to this part of the world, even before this all started, you realize how close World War II still is to everybody. I mean, it's and the further east you go, the more you feel it, definitely. And so when it started, the war started in Ukraine, and in fact, long before, when the first, with Georgia and the Maidan, all these things, the Poles and the Baltic states and the Finns and all these people who understood what the war had been like last time, immediately clicked back into that sort of mentality of, oh my goodness, it's happening again. And then when you read stories about Kursk or other places that featured so prominently in the Second World War, it's a very, very eerie reminder of how close and how fragile this peace is. And there's certainly no love lost between the Poles, the Balts, as I said, the Swedes, the Finns, in their dealings with Russia, because of course the Nazis were horrific and violent and brutal, but their tenure here was relatively short. But then, of course, the Soviets, if you're talking about the Baltic states or Ukraine or whatever else, the Holodomor and so on, they've experienced high Stalinism. They've experienced the horrors and brutality of the Soviet system as well. And then, of course, after the war was over, behind the Iron Curtain, experienced all those years of Stalinism, and then, it got a little easier afterwards, but it was still pretty awful. And so they click right back into, well, of course the Russians would behave like this. Of course Putin's going to behave like this. And there's really no wiggle room for any kind of other interpretations of what the Russians are doing here. And in fact, to the extent that, if we're talking about contemporary politics in this region, you see a kind of a new conglomeration of a new grouping in Europe, which does, sort of, 20 years ago, you'd say that the heart of Europe or Western Europe was Germany and France, the powerhouse and the kind of locomotive behind, Western Germany, Western Europe, I mean. But now you see a new constellation of those who kind of got the Russian threat earlier and those who don't seem to be reacting to it much. And in that, as I said, Sweden, the Finns, the Scandinavian countries, generally speaking, the Baltic nations, Poland very much, and so on. There's really a sense that the danger is back and that they're on the front line.
In your book, there are 4 people that I want to ask you about. This is nothing new, but I would like, if you could, describe each one of them. They all committed suicide. You probably know who I'm talking about. Let's start with Hitler. Give me your profile of Hitler.
Hitler, Austrian corporal, devastated by the First World War loss, Treaty of Versailles, unimaginative, I would say, quite probably intellectually not particularly bright, but discovered after the war that his passionate hatred of the Versailles Treaty and so on had a resonance with many of the other soldiers, and he started to work, realized he had an oratory skill, and began to believe in his messianic powers, that he was going to be the great leader who was going to lead Germany to its true calling, which was to once again regain its place, not only in Europe, but perhaps even in the world. unfortunately, he came to prominence at a time when the Germans were very vulnerable. They had been this huge, gigantic empire, a kind of nouveau riche empire that had grown so quickly, from Bismarck, 1871, then this huge power, and then crashed with 1918. And they had come to believe that this empire was justified and absolutely right, and this power and might was absolutely theirs. And then they had this terrible defeat. This is why, again, comparisons between contemporary Europe and what happened with Hitler are very, very dangerous, because one has to look at the total, absolute sort of devastation, also psychological crash that the Germans went through in 1918, which is very different from the sorts of things that are happening in Europe today, at least the west of Ukraine. But on that note, Hitler took advantage of this. He believed in his own propaganda. He drank the Kool-Aid, as they say, and he led Germany to originally, or at first, quite astounding victories. I don't think he ever would have been more popular than the day he came back to Berlin from defeating France. But then, of course, made the fatal mistake of biting off more than he could chew by not defeating the UK, and then by going into Russia and not defeating Stalin. So he was doomed, effectively. I think the really interesting place to go, the one place everybody should go to try and understand Hitler, is not Berchtesgaden or even Berlin, where the bunker was, but up to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair in Kentchen, in what used to be East Prussia, because it's a complex of massive bunkers of 7-8 meters of rebar and concrete that were built to house Hitler and his team. And he spent almost 900 days up there in this gray, dank, miserable forest with all these bunkers, and nobody else could come in and out. It was completely isolated. And I think this is the place that one can physically sort of feel that chill of this man's mental state as he was running the war.
A little sidebar in your book, Hitler's injections of glucose and soon cocaine administered by his trusted but utterly incompetent doctor. What was the point of putting that in the book?
Well, I think it just showed that he was mentally unstable. I mean, I think, he had all sorts of, he was a vegetarian. He had all sorts of stomach complaints and cramps and so on. A lot of the others did too. Von den Bach-Zelewski and many of the others, Himmler with his famous masseurs, would constantly have to have sort of therapies, because they all had stomach pains and cramps and things, probably brought on by stress, because if you're mass murdering millions of people, it probably does take a toll somewhere in the back of their minds. And Hitler was prone to this sort of thing as well. And he had his quack doctor, Theodor Morell, who discovered that Hitler felt better if he got cocaine injections and various other vitamins and other things. So this was being administered to him. People often say, when they see those pictures of Hitler just at the end of the war, when he's this almost obscene, macabre pictures where he's got these sort of 16-year-old boys and he's giving them medals and pats on the head and saying, good lad, and whatever else. But you can see, his hands shaking, he's physically a wreck. And part of that has to do with the aftermath, of course, of the 20th of July bomb. But it also has to do with this litany of drugs that he's being fed by his doctor.
Heinrich Himmler.
Heinrich Himmler, particularly unpleasant man. All the people who met him said that if he was walking through a crowd, you wouldn't even notice him. He was a sort of small, unimpressive character. He came to prominence around Hitler after being really a failure at almost everything. He even failed at being a chicken farmer after the First World War was over. He came to prominence with Hitler and ingratiated himself to Hitler by creating the first sort of bodyguard around Hitler, the origins of the SS. And he obviously was very ambitious, and he was terribly impressed by Hitler. But he also began to understand Hitler's need, for example, to control the SA, the brown shirts. And Hitler was looking for an ally in order to be able to do that. So the SS grows, and the SS are used in the Night of the Long Knives to kill off the leadership of the brown shirts. This gives Himmler a huge boost to his trustworthiness by Hitler. And then he is given sort of free rein to develop the SS as he sees fit. Hence the tremendously devastating, cruel, powerful killing machine that comes to effectively define the Third Reich, the SS.
Why did Hitler and Himmler hate the Poles so much?
Well, this is a very long and interesting animosity that goes back to the Teutonic Knights. The idea that Poland, accepted Christianity from the Czechs instead of the Germans, and that there was always this rivalry between the Drang nach Osten, this sort of colonization of the East, had been blocked by these horrible Poles, according to the German myths and legends and so on. And then it gets worse. For example, under Frederick the Great, with the partitions of Poland. Poland always stood for, and it still to this day does. It's something I don't have Polish roots. It's something I only understood when I came to live here. The deep, deep sense in Poland amongst the Poles of the love of individual freedom. It's the closest thing that I've ever experienced that comes to that sort of Anglo-Saxon, American, Canadian, British sense of liberty for the individual, that the state exists so that the individual can be free. Whereas the German mentality was very different. And the Frederick the Great, for example, begins the carving up of Poland because the government in Poland was very difficult to manage because of this, their own constitution and so on. And they became weaker, whereas the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians were, especially the Prussians, building up these very, very powerful armies. And Frederick the Great says, well, I'm going to eat Poland leaf by leaf as if eating an artichoke. And that's exactly what he did. So Poland was partitioned 3 times until it was removed from the map for 123 years. And the thing is that when you're partitioning a power, when you're taking somebody over, you have to justify it somehow, and this is exactly what they did. They put the Poles down. They made them seem weak and ineffectual and backward. And this carries on, of course, into the Bismarckian era, where in the Prussian or German parts of Poland, the Poles aren't allowed to speak their language. They have to be educated according to the German curriculum and so on. It's a little bit like the way the English treated the Welsh, or this sort of underdog, mentality that they don't really come up to standard quite. And the propaganda was perpetrated in Germany for decades and decades, for centuries. And then, of course, the invasion of Poland. Well, again, if you're invading a country, you have to justify it. You have to say, well, there's a reason we're taking you over. Well, we're taking you over because you're Slavs, and therefore you're corrupt. And first of all, 30% of your population is Jewish. That's terrible. But even the Slavs were considered to be Untermenschen, sort of subhuman. And therefore, for example, Hitler's plans for Warsaw were to create a new German settlement called Neue Warschau, in which the population was basically to be exterminated, except for a small percentage, maybe 40,000 people, to live on the East Bank, to work as cooks and cleaners and, that sort of thing. And then the rest of the city was going to be rebuilt in this traditional German style with little pointy red roofs and little curving streets. So this was the mentality toward the Slavs, toward the Poles in particular. And there's always this, the Poles are always very proud of the fact that there was no, there was always collaboration everywhere, but no collaboration, no Quisling, no SS Galicia division drawn up from Poland. Part of that is the Polish sense of, well, we're not going to bow down to the Germans. But it was also because Hitler would never have collaborated with the Poles. He refused to have any, Himmler sometimes went up to him and said, these Poles are fighting quite hard. Maybe we should take some of them into our units. And Hitler refused. So it's a sort of double-edged sword. But the hatred, the animosity of the Germans to the Poles was, as I said, the Aryan race to Untermenschen.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. Go back to the when the decision was made by Himmler and Hitler to take Warsaw completely to the ground. How many people lived in Warsaw when it started, and how many people were there when it was over, and how many buildings were still there when they were finished?
Well, this is one of the tragedies because, of course, over 1 million people had lived in Warsaw before the war, and the Jewish population had been decimated. So there were about 740,000 or so people living in the West Bank of Warsaw when the Warsaw Uprising started. And as I said, the decimation of the civilian population was between 150 and 200,000 people, about 40,000 AK soldiers, give or take. It's very difficult to get the figures exactly right because the a lot of people were killed, burned, their bodies were burned in the streets and so on. I mean, it's very hard to know exactly, but around about that number, about 200,000 were taken to this transit camp called Pruszków, which was a transit camp, a Durchlager, which is just outside of Warsaw. And then they were divided into groups. About 60,000 ended up in camps, including Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and others. Others were sent as slave laborers into the Reich. It was Albert Speer's last big intake of slave laborers, actually, people from Warsaw who were forced to go and work in factories and so on. And then the others were expected to go and find somewhere to live out in the countryside, usually old people and so on. And then Hitler kept his word with the order for Warsaw, which was given on the 1st of August, 1944, where the whole city was to be razed to the ground. So they looted it completely. First, everything, metal door handles and anything they could find. And then they went with special sappers, engineers, and so on. As I said, the manpower needed was huge, and went door to door, building to building, and completely, utterly destroyed the city. And the tragedy of this was that there were many, many things, like the entire city archives of Warsaw, showing where buildings were and who owned buildings, and, or document centers, libraries. All of these things were destroyed because the idea was this kind of vindictive idea that you can completely erase Polish culture is what they thought of. They could see this violent, how much they despised this place, and so many cultural treasures and things were also lost in this. So that Warsaw, when the Soviets finally come in January 1945, is just a smoldering ruin. And the other tragedy about that kind of door-to-door, building-by-building destruction was that there were still a lot of people hiding in the ruins, particularly Jews, in the former ghettos, hiding in the sewers, hiding in the what had been the quote-unquote area inside. There were bunkers, people literally hiding underground, encased underground. And as the Germans went building by building, blowing them up, burning them, and torching them, a lot of these people were killed or forced to come out of hiding and were murdered. So it was just, horror upon horror, really, for the city.
I can remember in your book, you're talking about the Germans would actually walk into a hospital, see people in bed in a hospital, and shoot them.
Yes, but this is something that was quite common on the Eastern Front, and on by both sides, incidentally. The level of violence by the Soviets to the Germans and the Germans to the Soviets was horrific. The Soviets are coming back through the other way. And they've seen what the Germans have done in the Soviet Union, and they're furious. So they do the same thing. But yeah, I mean, the treatment of the hospitals in the Warsaw Uprising was particularly disgusting because, nurses were raped, doctors were murdered in front of their patients, people were murdered in their beds. It was truly horrific. There was a particularly nasty group called the Rona Brigade, which was a kind of renegade Russian traitors who were operating in another district of Warsaw. They took over, for example, one of the infamous events was their taking over of the Madame Curie Radium Institute, because of course Madame Curie was originally from Warsaw and she donated some radium for cancer patients. So they went in and raped the women and raped the nurses and then murdered them in the most vile way. It was truly horrific.
Two more people on the list that I want to ask you about. These are all four Germans, and as I said, all four of them ended up committing suicide. This one is Hermann Goering, and what impact did he have on Poland?
Well, Hermann Goering was, probably compared to Hitler and Himmler, had less of an impact in this. But for example, was always a figure in this war. So, of course, the attack in 1939, hugely important. He oversaw the bombardment of Warsaw because Warsaw refused to surrender in 1939, and so he oversaw the carpet bombing of Warsaw. It was the first terror bombing of a capital city in history. And then during the Warsaw Uprising, he did the same thing. The fighting was going on the streets, but particularly the fighting in the old town. The old town in Warsaw is a kind of old medieval walls, a very, very densely populated medieval little streets. And it was very, very difficult for Hitler to get his tanks into this area because of the way that this district was constructed. So it was very mightily defended. And Hermann Goering came up with the brilliant idea of, okay, well, let's just bomb it. So these planes would take off, on at clockwork every day, In the morning, they'd go and they'd fly, drop bombs, mostly incendiary bombs, by the way, just deliberately to burn and burn buildings, but also people. And then they'd go, they'd have their lunch, and then they'd come back in the afternoon and do the same thing, just over and over again for 63 days.
What about Joseph Goebbels?
Well, Goebbels was, again, he was slightly more removed from the fray in Warsaw, propaganda minister, the infamous club-footed, person who controlled all the propaganda. But of course, he was very important in the sense of how the Poles were perceived by the Germans. He carried on this propaganda. The Poles were Untermenschen, and they didn't deserve their own state. They didn't deserve their own country. We Germans are going to go and we're going to develop it. We're going to take it over. We're going to make it beautiful and Germanize it. And the Poles are illegitimate. They shouldn't be there, and we're going to push them out. And so that was very much his kind of story that the Germans believed. And in fact, I remember, because I did before this a book on Berlin, and I was in Berlin for many years interviewing many, many people and so on. There were lots and lots of people I talked to who said, no, Poland started the war. They provoked the war. They were talking, of course, about things like the infamous attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, which was set up by Hitler to make it look as if, as a provocation attack, to make it a false flag attack, to make it look as if Poland had started the war. But even well after the war, people I talked to believed in this propaganda. So Goebbels was tremendously dangerous because he told the Germans this story. And of course, the press was totally controlled. There was, of course, radio and media and newspapers and so on, but they were totally controlled by Goebbels' propaganda machine. And so the Germans just had no alternative. Even listening to the BBC broadcasts was possibly punishable by death in Germany. So he had complete control over the story.
How did the Poles communicate with one another when they weren't allowed to run the radio stations or publish the newspapers?
They did anyway. They did underground. So what was so amazing about Poland is not only did they, in 1944, have an underground army, a maximum about 650,000 people, but they had also a complete alternative state, which is perhaps less well known. A complete alternative state with underground universities, underground printing presses, underground everything, medical facilities, just everything. This was something that goes deep in Polish history because, as I said, even under the partitions, under the Germans, Russians and Austrians, the Poles who were told you can't speak your own language, for example, well, of course they did, but they did it secretly. So they learned how to live an alternative existence. And they did the same thing under the Germans, although it was enormously dangerous. They were constantly under attack. The famous prison or infamous prison in Warsaw, Pawiak prison, where tens and tens of thousands of prisoners went through. Many people died or were murdered there. But the Poles were just very, very courageous, and they created this whole underground. So underground newspapers across the road from where I live in Warsaw, in the city, was an underground radio station. It was run by the family that still lives there. There was a house, and there was a basement, and then there was a basement under the basement. And the Germans kept hearing these radio signals, and they kept looking for it. They couldn't find it. So this was just the way the Poles were. My father-in-law also ran a radio station called Radio Anna, which was the radio station for the commanders, in the Home Army during the uprising. So all these secret stations and all these sorts of things. Same with the underground press, all the way through the German occupation. There were a number of very important newspapers. Bulletin Informationer came out almost every day, even through the uprising. So they were incredible.
Let's take a moment and go back in your life to the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, a beautiful little town on the west coast of Canada.
Where did you go to college?
I started off in Victoria, but then I moved over to Oxford, and I finished my degree at Oxford, wrote my doctorate at Oxford.
What was your doctorate about in Oxford?
It was called The Political Manipulation of History, and it was a look at how history was written in East Germany as compared to West Germany, particularly focusing on World War II and the Holocaust and so on. Because I'd originally gone to East Germany in 1985 when it was very difficult for foreigners to get in. And I'd studied music all my life. And one of the people that I studied and loved was Johann Sebastian Bach. And in the 1980s, Erich Honecker, who was the leader of East Germany, was determined to try and show that East Germany was the true cultural Germany. No, all the Nazis had lived in the West, in Bonn and Frankfurt, and all the good Germans and Beethoven and Bach and all these things. Complete nonsense, of course. But so it so happened that Johann Sebastian Bach had spent much of his life in former East Germany. So I was one of the few Westerners who was allowed to go on this very, very controlled trip to look at where he'd lived, where he'd worked, some of the instruments he played and this kind of thing. So that was my introduction to East Germany. So I went all over East Germany, but I was absolutely, completely fascinated by Berlin, because Berlin was, a city like an entire brain that had been carved down the middle by the wall. And it, from 1945 to 89 had these two completely different systems operating on their respective sides of this brain. And it was fascinating to look at how powerful the communist or totalitarian system is, how easy actually it is to convince people that black is white and 2 + 2 is 1. I mean, and the Western side of Germany at that time was also fascinating, because it was just the time that the West Germans were starting to become interested in the Holocaust, in the Shoah, the historical strike, so-called, where you had, Habermas, arguing with various other historians and so on. So because in the late 40s and 1950s, even into the 60s, there was really very little interest in that part of history. It was more sort of military history and so on, kind of exonerating the Wehrmacht and all that kind of stuff. Whereas by the 70s, really interesting historical debates were taking place. And so I was part of that on the Western side, but then very much part of, I'm just trying to understand what a totalitarian system does to people who are being lied to all the time, effectively. But then the fascinating thing was I went to Poland, and it was completely different, because East Germany was totally controlled with Stasi. One in every 12th person was in the Stasi, whatever. And I remember my first trip to Poland by myself in 1986, and I took the train into Warsaw, and I went, oh my God, this place is really ugly. It's just been, it was a ruin. It's still, bombed up buildings and stuff. But I remember going to the university, because I had a little place to live next to the university, meeting students out the front with illegal literature, going, I don't want to use the terms, but let's just fill in the blank about the commies. Every swear word you could imagine. They hated communism. And they were all, solidarity, Lech Wałęsa, all that stuff. And they were totally unafraid. They openly walking on the street, just saying, we hate this system. Whereas in East Germany, it was very, very different. And that's also partly to do with the legacy of the war. That a lot of people had hidden their Nazi past, whatever. As long as they behaved in the communist system, they would be left alone. But that also meant that part of East Germany was completely unreconstructed. And you were asking me earlier about, the implications today of what happened in the war, etc. Well, the fact is that the East Germans didn't go through that whole process of examining their past and learning about their past and so on. And so the AfD has a stronghold in East Germany, partly because they never really worked through this history in the same way.
What do you think? Maybe it would be like learning history in the West German classroom, or an East German classroom today, or a Polish classroom about this time in history?
Well, I think that the Polish curriculum, these things are now pretty well gone over by the European Union. There's a sort of understanding of what the curriculum should include. We must include something about the Second World War, the Holocaust, and so on. This is very different from 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I was doing my original research, because that was, World War II, was basically not mentioned in the Polish classroom. Nothing about things like Katyn or the Home Army or anything like that was mentioned. So it's really the collapse of communism that opened that whole thing up. Now, in my estimation, and I've seen a lot of these school books and so on, and indeed my daughters went through school in Poland. So I looked, of course, at their history books, and they were very fair and they were very well done. There was a phase in Poland under the previous government where the sort of nationalistic view became much more dominant, and there was an attempt to change some of the narrative to say that, all Poles were wonderful and there were never any Polish collaborators, all this kind of nonsense. that sort of nationalistic spin on history. But generally speaking, I would say they're very good. And the same with the German textbooks. There's a real attempt to look at this history, to try and talk about it, to deal with it, come to terms with it. But it also, of course, depends on your district. It depends on your teachers. It depends on the attitude. You can have a great textbook, but if the teacher in your part of, outside Magdeburg doesn't want to talk about the war, you're not going to talk about the war. So that's also part of it. It's that cultural milieu that they operate in.
How long have you lived in Warsaw?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I first came in 86. I first lived here in 1991 for some period of time. But just because of the nature of my life, then went back to Oxford for many years as a fellow there, and then came back and forth and back and forth. So it's been kind of a very sort of choppy existence. But now, I mean, I spend a good chunk of my time here because I'm a full-time university professor here. So during the terms I'm here, spend a lot of time in Canada still, and lots of time in the UK because my daughters are now at school in the UK, and I've got a big family there too. So I'm kind of a strange person to pin down in that sense.
In your book, Warsaw 1944, you do discuss the Tehran meeting, and you talk about FDR and Churchill and Stalin. I wrote this down. This is from your book. Churchill inherently distrusted Stalin, but Roosevelt believed that he had forged a special friendship with Uncle Joe, and this worked against the British Prime Minister. Did he have a special relationship with Uncle Joe?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This was, unfortunately, Roosevelt he was a great wartime president, there's no question, but he had some weaknesses, as do we all. And one of them was his deep belief in his own charm and his ability to talk to anybody and talk them around to his point of view. And Stalin was a master manipulator. He's absolutely brilliant. I mean, of the three around the table, Stalin is in the end comes out victorious in many ways. He gets exactly what he wants from this war. And he plays them brilliantly. And he understands, Roosevelt. He knows exactly what he's doing. But Stalin was absolutely dyed-in-the-wool Bolshevik. He really believed that the communist revolution was going to come sooner or later. And he saw both Churchill and Roosevelt as, the representatives of the doomed capitalist class. For him, they were vermin. They were doomed to the dustbin of history as far as he was concerned. And he was more frightened of Churchill because Churchill had been very vocal anti-Bolshevik, after the Russian Revolution and so on. Whereas Roosevelt, had not been so much. And so from the perspective of Stalin, no, he did not. Roosevelt believed that he had something that didn't exist. And this is like, my husband worked in Russia for 6 years in the Yeltsin years, and during the Yeltsin years, and I was based at Oxford. I spent lots of time in Russia, and I really have to say that the longer I spent there, the less I knew it. I mean, it became more and more confusing as I spent more and more time in Russia, and that includes relationships with people, what their mentality is, what they say versus what they really think. I mean, it is a completely different culture, but because people looked like me and they sort of dressed like me and they kind of talked like me, you just think, oh yeah, well, easy. I really understand them. It'd be a word of warning to any American or other leader when they think they understand what a Russian leader is saying, that they should be cautious because the culture is different. And so I think that Roosevelt did make that mistake, and therefore he had his own ambitions as well. Of course, he wanted to get Stalin into the war in Japan. He wanted to create the United Nations. He had the sort of beliefs that China, Russia, yes, Churchill and Britain, but the new world order was going to be China, he and Uncle Joe, and the world was going to be this wonderful, peaceful, lovely place. Well, it wasn't.
Given what happened in World War II, both from the German side and the Russian side, and then beyond, who does Poland trust today?
Poland absolutely, completely, 100% loves the United States. It's hard to fathom whatever happened at Yalta and whatever mistakes were made. The relationship between Poland and the United States is so deep. This comes back to this concept of freedom, of liberty. I mean, I've been coming back and forth here a very long time, and it doesn't seem to have mattered who was president. It doesn't seem to have mattered, if sometimes things were said or whatever else, that there's this deep relationship between Poland understanding that their future lies with the West, and their future lies, and the protector of the West, militarily and otherwise, is the United States. And so the hope in Poland is that continues, of course. They never had any patience with the sort of 1970s or 80s, demonstrations, this sort of some parts of Europe, sort of anti-Americanism in some parts of Europe, whatever. That just never, ever hit Poland.
Got to give you your time back. One last question. You are associated with the World War II Museum in New Orleans. In what way?
Well, I'm a presidential counselor at the World War II Museum, but I do a lot with them. I've been a fellow there. I bring groups of travelers from the World War II Museum to Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, this whole region, taking people exactly to the Wolf's Lair, places like that, to try and understand the rise of Hitler and the implications of this war in the East, because the tendency in the West is not really understand how enormous the land war was on the Eastern Front, and therefore effectively, which is what gave Stalin the clout that he had in places like Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam, because of the boots on the ground effect, that the bloodletting that had happened on the Eastern Front was so vast that some people often ask me, well, what about Yalta? Were the Poles sold down the river and all that? The reality is, yes, they were treated very badly and they should have been involved and so on. But the fact is that the constellation of where the armies ended and the agreement in Tehran and then Yalta to divide Germany the way it was divided, it meant that Poland was always going to be behind the Iron Curtain. And it's very difficult to imagine a scenario that it wouldn't have happened the way it did. It's just that one could do it a bit more honorably, I think. That was probably the point.
During the war, how many concentration camps or extermination camps existed in Poland?
Well, overall, there were about 40,000 camps, because the camps, sub-camps, prisoner of war camps, and so on, was just a huge network. The whole Nazi system was based on violence, but the big extermination camps were all in Poland: Chełmno, Sobibor, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and also Majdanek, which is sometimes included as one of the big extermination camps, wasn't really. So that constellation of those camps, the Operation Reinhardt camps, as they're known, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, were set up in Poland specifically to mass murder the Jews of Poland, which the population was around about 3 million. So that was the target of those extermination camps. That's what makes the Holocaust, the Shoah, the mass murder of the Jews, different from all those other camps, slave labor camps, Dachau, all these other places. There were Jewish prisoners, there were Jews worked to death, starved to death, and so on. But there was that extra kind of layer of horror of that industrialized mass murder that takes place. And those camps were located on Polish territory, primarily because most of the victims in the Reinhardt camps were Polish. The exception was Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Jews from all over Europe were brought to be killed, whether from Amsterdam or from Paris or from Greece or wherever.
I know your book, Warsaw 1944, is still available if somebody wants to buy it. But what about your newest book? And are you writing one now?
Yes, I'm writing a book about the occupation of Poland during the Nazi time, and then how that occupation was transformed under Stalin. How that one dictatorship fed into another, and then the fight in Poland under the communist era for the fight for solidarity and for eventually freedom from both totalitarianisms.
Alexandra Ritchie, thank you so much for your time. And we could spend about 4 or 5 more hours and just begin getting to what's in this book. But thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.